They called him Pastor Ezra Cole long before he ever wore a collar. In the narrow streets of Ashburn, an old river town that smelled of wet lumber and hot bread, people had a way of giving names before meaning. Ezra's meaning came later, like an echo that arrives after the shout, bent by the turns of the valley. He grew up in a house that knew the sound of pages more than the sound of laughter. His father, Arthur Cole, was a carpenter who built pews that took the ache out of kneeling and pulpits that made humble men stand taller. His mother, Ruth, spoke in a low, even register as if her voice had been tuned to a hymn. Money was thin, time was thinner, but reverence was abundant. Ruth's faith was a quiet fire, steady, warm, and trained to flame only at the altar of God. She would touch Ezra's forehead each morning and say, "Mercy first, son." Then, after a beat, truth next. Ezra always wondered which one belonged to him. On Sundays, Arthur brought the carpenter's hands to church. Knuckles scuffed, palms skinned, wrists silvered with sawdust. He'd sit stiff as a plank while the minister thundered scripture. Ezra watched his father's profile in the stained light, the pain lines smoothing whenever the old gospel hymn rose like wind through wheat. There, in a shaft of blue glass, it seemed perfectly possible to become a different kind of man, one made of oak and promise. But Ashburn wasn't only hymnals and river fog. It was also the color of power, the red silk of a judge's tie, the coal-black coat of the banker who measured men as though they were boards to be cut. Ezra saw how a certain gravity pooled around those who stood in front of a room with words in their mouth and a book in their hand. He saw how people, tough men who could lift barrels as if they were children, tilted their heads like sunflowers following the sun. He felt, as a boy, how any room rearranged itself around a voice that knew its own pitch. Ezra's calling wasn't a trumpet blast, but a drip of water through stone. It came through small, repetitive moments. The first time he read aloud from the book of Psalms, and a shy girl started crying. The day, Mrs. Teague, a widow with thundercloud hair, said, "When you speak, I believe me again." He learned that some truths arrived like hammers, others like rain. The hammer was satisfying. The rain did the real work. If he had a flaw, it moved like a shadow at noon, nearly invisible but always there. Pride, but not the glittering kind that announces itself with a gold watch and a fat laugh. Ezra's pride was sober, tidy, and difficult to hate. It was the pride of being right, and then being right again. Each time his counsel helped, the world aligned with a click. Each click was a tooth on a gear, and soon the gear turned by itself. Pride taught him that mercy and truth were not companions but weights on a scale, and he was the one who knew where to place the measure. Ruth, sensing the tilt in her son, tried to shore him with gentleness. She folded love into bread and tucked it in his satchel. She wrote verses on slips of paper, a bruised reed he will not break, and hid them in his jacket pockets. He'd find them at inconvenient times, like when he was about to deliver thunder from the pulpit of the youth chapel, and the paper would flutter into his lap like a white moth. He would feel, then, the restraining hand of a mother who believed in softness even amid a world built of hard edges. There was another current in town, moving under the rest like a dark river below a bright one. St. Bridget's Catholic Church sat at the top of Willow Street, white as a wedding. Ezra grew up hearing it talked about as a place of incense and misunderstanding, a house where the Bible wore veils. The Virgin Mary, Our Lady, as they called her, stood in an alcove by the steps, hands open as if expecting rain. On feast days, the Catholics laid blue flowers at her feet. They did it with a tenderness that looked suspiciously like love, idolatry, Arthur Cole would say, not bitter exactly, but as one might name a weed. They turn their hearts to a statue and forget the living God. Ruth would reply, or they turn their hearts to the living God and need a mother's face to borrow courage. Ezra stood between them, and he learned that even love could contain a quarrel. In the evenings, he'd pass St. Brigid's on his way home from boys' choir practice. The statue glowed an impossible blue under the street lamp, the kind of blue he saw in winter skies just before snow. Once, when he was 12, he stopped and studied the face. It was not beautiful in a worldly way. The mouth was small, the eyes too large, but the carver had cut a softness into the stone, an attentive sorrow that made even a boy feel catalogued down to his secret hurts. He hated that feeling. He hated that a piece of rock could see him. He shoved his hands into his coat and walked faster. When Ezra was 17, Ruth got sick. Her breath became a ladder she climbed with visible effort. "It will pass," Arthur said, but sickness turned out to be a house that built more rooms. Ezra fetched water, made broth, learned the language of thermometers and tinctures. He prayed like a man hammering. The words were straight and strong. "Mercy first," he'd say. "Truth next." Ruth smiled with cracked lips and tapped the order with her finger as if to remind him that mercy had to be more than a word. One evening, Father O'Rourke from St. Brigid's came to the door. He was a compact man with hair like smoke and a voice that never hurried. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand. "I heard," he said. "We keep a candle burning for the sick. May I leave one for your wife?" Arthur took the candle with a stiff politeness and set it on the mantel without lighting it. "We'll keep our house in the Lord's keeping," he said. Father O'Rourke nodded as if Arthur had offered him a cup of tea he could not accept. His eyes went to Ezra then, and something flickered between them, a brief recognition that they were men, both, and not only ideas. "If you need anything," O'Rourke said, and left. Ruth died in late November when the river was a moving mirror for a sky of iron. The house cracked with absence. Ezra felt the world lose a dimension, like a drawing rubbed thin by an eraser. The funeral was held at their church, and the room was full of ordinary grief, trembling lips, coats buttoned wrong, a baby hiccuping in the third pew. Ezra stood up to speak. He did fine, people said. He said what men say when language has limits, and they are too proud to admit it. He thanked God for Ruth's life, as if gratitude were a duty he could pay in exact change. After the burial, when everyone had gone to bring casseroles and the heavy kindnesses of neighbors, Ezra walked alone. He found himself at St. Brigid's without intending to. The Virgin's statue held a dusting of frost on her shoulders like lace. Someone, one of those women with rosaries that made tiny music in their hands, had left a white shawl around the statue's neck, as if stone could feel cold. Ezra stared, and anger rose in him, not against the Catholics, not against the statue, but against the idea that comfort could come from a face that never breathed. He did a wicked thing in his heart. He compared the stone's stillness with his mother's struggle for air. He resented how easy the carved compassion looked. "Take your pity elsewhere," he muttered. The street was empty except for a cat that moved like smoke along a fence. He felt foolish for speaking to a sculpture, and also, strangely, heard. Grief became a teacher that winter, and it taught him hard lessons without apology. He learned how to preach from within a hollow. People came to him because he did not waste words, because he offered answers shaped like doors rather than questions shaped like labyrinths. His sermons were clean lines pulled tight. He warned against the comforting curve of idolatries, anything that looked like a mother where there should be a cross. He went to seminary in the city, where the buildings made shadows big enough to hide whole lives. There he was, praised for his clarity, for the precise construction of his thought. Professors described him as surgical. He took the word as a compliment. Surgery, after all, saves. He crafted arguments like instruments and learned how to hold them without trembling. He debated a Catholic student once about the role of Mary. The other young man spoke softly about intercession, about the human need for a maternal tenderness in the architecture of salvation. Ezra replied with chapter and verse, his voice a measured river. The room hummed when he finished. The Catholic nodded, almost grateful for being so efficiently defeated. Ezra felt the click of the gear again. He returned to Ashburn not long after ordination, the river town unchanged in its essentials. Arthur had grown smaller, as if a portion of him had departed with Ruth. He spent mornings in the workshop and evenings with a blank stare fixed on a corner of the room where nothing ever happened. Ezra visited often, but they did not speak of Ruth, as if each mention would stir ashes they could not bear to taste. The church welcomed Ezra with the eagerness communities reserve for the familiar. He was a native son, and his sermons were a promise that God could be ordered and understood. He drew in the disquieted and the precise. The pews filled with men who appreciated maps and women who wanted their boys to grow into straight lines. Across town, St. Brigid's remained a kind of parallel world. The Catholics processed with their statues in spring, and the blue candles winked in their nave like a constellation of small mercies. Ezra did not attend their feasts or their funerals, but he watched from a distance with an interest composed partly of disdain and partly of a feeling he did not name. The Virgin kept her station by the steps, her face an invitation on the way to bread and milk and the ordinary commerce of the living. He told himself that he envied them nothing. He told himself that their comfort was borrowed, their reverence misdirected. And yet, when he walked past the statue at dusk, he kept his eyes forward, not unlike a man passing a mirror he did not wish to check. If a man is made of what he loves and what he refuses, Ezra was made of words he loved and tenderness he refused. He wore duty like a well-cut suit and found that people rarely asked what the cloth cost him. He stood at bedsides and gravesides, delivered babies' blessings and bent over open caskets, and everywhere the world looked back at him with expectant faces. He did not tremble, he did not shrink. He did, however, carry a narrowing inside him, a channel through which mercy struggled to flow. It was in that narrowing that his hostility toward the Virgin Mary took root, not simply because doctrine demanded it, though doctrine made a sturdy trellis, but because the idea of a mother standing beside the suffering of a woman's open hands, steadying the ladder of a person's breath, felt like mockery in the wake of Ruth's absence. He would not say that aloud. He was too educated for that. He would not even admit it to God in the fevered hiss of prayer. But the bitterness ripened, and he mistook it for zeal. On a late summer evening, as the swallows stitched a black lace across the gold sky, and the river dragged a line of light into its throat, Ezra stood on the steps of his church and looked toward Willow Street. Bells from St. Brigid's popped like bubbles of honey in the air. He thought of his mother's slips of paper and of mercy, written in a hand that never forced. He put his hands in his pockets and felt a worn scrap he had somehow kept. The ink was faded. A bruised reed he will not break. He closed his fingers around it until the edges cut. Pastor Ezra Cole, the town would call him. They would say his voice could peel paint and heal doubt. They would say he was a man who loved God fiercely and people efficiently. And in the shadows behind those compliments, a quieter sentence would form, waiting for its occasion. It would say, he had a quarrel with a mother he no longer had, and a mother he refused to meet. Outside St. Brigid's, the Virgin kept her vigil, a pale witness of blue. The years had made a gloss of her stone. People brushed their fingertips against her feet as they passed, as if greeting a friend that town law did not require, but their hearts did. Ezra told himself their gestures were superstition, dressed up pretty. The wind lifted. The shawl someone had wrapped around the statue's shoulders fluttered, an obedient bird. He turned away, back to his study where the books stood like city towers, certain and straight. He opened one and began to write a sermon about false mediators and the immediate mercy of Christ. He sharpened his thought until it gleamed. Outside, the river slipped past with its dark patience. The day's last light tiled the church windows with squares of bruised violet and gold. Somewhere, a child laughed, the sound skipping like a stone. The town settled into itself, every house nursing a small fire, every soul making its private bargains with the night. And the pastor, who would one day spit where others laid their flowers, steadied his pen, certain that truth could live without a face to soften it. Pastor Ezra Cole did not take long to establish himself as a figure of authority in Ashburn. By the time he had served 5 years in the pulpit of Grace Chapel, the town was already speaking his name in lowered voices, half in admiration, half in caution. He was not the kind of man people approached casually. His shoulders squared too perfectly, his stride cut through streets like a plow through soil, and his eyes held a brightness that seemed to evaluate the worth of every face they landed on. The first years of his ministry were filled with energy. He preached with a fire that startled the older parishioners who had grown accustomed to sermons as gentle reminders rather than as sword thrusts. Ezra's words were lean, muscular, stripped of sentiment. He would stand behind the pulpit, tall and motionless, and then, like a lightning bolt without thunder, deliver sentences that split the air with absolute certainty. "God does not barter with compromise," he declared once on a Sunday morning, voice ringing like a bell made of iron. "He does not share his throne with statues, candles, or half measures of devotion. He is jealous because he is love. And love that does not demand the whole heart is not love at all." The congregation hung on him, and many wept not because his words were tender, but because they felt carved open, as if the marrow of their sins had been exposed under a surgeon's knife. Ezra became known not for healing wounds, but for naming them without flinching. In a town where pain was often hidden under layers of silence and politeness, his honesty had the effect of both cleansing and terrifying. Yet beneath the applause, there grew a subtle current of unease. Ezra rarely spoke of mercy anymore. He rarely spoke of comfort, of tenderness, of the God who wept. Instead, his image of the divine was a ruler unbending, a flame that tolerated no shadow. His parishioners felt safe under his leadership, but not necessarily loved. Among those who noticed was Clara Merrick, a schoolteacher in her 30s who had spent her life attending Grace Chapel. She admired Ezra's discipline and his eloquence, but she wondered at his silences what he did not say, what he seemed to bury under the scaffolding of theology. After one sermon, she approached him, her voice quiet but steady. "Pastor, your words are strong, but sometimes people come here to be held, not to be broken." This he smiled. Ezra gave her a long, almost clinical stare. "The Lord breaks to heal. If the bone is set wrong, mercy alone will not straighten it." Clara tilted her head, unsatisfied. "But bones aren't the only things that ache. Some of us need warmth, not correction." Ezra's jaw tightened, though he did not show offense. He gave her the kind of smile that looked more like dismissal than agreement. "The warmth of truth is enough. Anything else risks indulgence." Zasli became to life. "Septanian God endured 5, my first Lindsayf." He walked away, and Clara stood in the aisle, feeling as though she had spoken to a door that looked like a window. Ezra's reputation spread beyond Ashburn. Other pastors came to hear him preach. Students from nearby seminaries cited his sermons in their papers. Invitations arrived for him to speak at conferences. His name began to appear in print, attached to words like clarity, zeal, courage. He wore these honors like armor, convincing himself they were only the fruit of obedience, though in the quiet of night, when the oil lamp flickered and the house groaned with silence, he felt a quickening in his chest, an intoxication that he refused to name pride. Pride, after all, was a sin of the frivolous, the flamboyant. Ezra's life was austere. His bed was hard, his diet plain, his study bare, except for the rows of books and a desk worn smooth by ink. He gave money to the poor, visited the sick, and kept a schedule so disciplined that parishioners whispered he was more clock than man. How could such rigor harbor sin? He told himself discipline was the cure for vanity, even as the secret delight of hearing his own name spoken in reverence became a quiet addiction. But there was a sore place in him, an abscess that no discipline could lance. It returned whenever he passed St. Brigid's, 2007. The Catholics had their festivals, bright banners and lilting hymns, women with shawls and children scattering petals on the steps. Ezra despised their joy. He saw it as a distraction from the stern gravity of the cross. Yet beneath the disdain lay something more dangerous: envy. One summer afternoon, he watched from across the street as the people of St. Brigid's gathered with candles in their hands, their faces tilted toward the statue of Mary. The priest led them in prayer, and though Ezra could not hear the words, he saw the softness in their eyes, the surrender in their posture. For a moment he was transported back to his mother's bedside, where Ruth's thin hand had brushed his cheek with that same softness, that same surrender. The memory cut him like glass. He turned sharply away, muttering scripture under his breath like a spell to banish ghosts. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Sentiment is the enemy of truth. Devotion to Mary is nothing more than a return to the womb, a cowardice dressed as piety. The faithful must learn to stand before God without a mother's hand to steady them." He closed the journal with a snap, as if sealing away something dangerous. But the words were not sealed. They festered. Among his parishioners, whispers grew. Some admired his ferocity, but feared his lack of gentleness. Others defended him. "He tells it like it is. He doesn't sugarcoat. Isn't that what a true shepherd should do?" One evening, after a particularly fierce sermon against false mediators, an old farmer named Henry Pike shook his head as he left the chapel. "Pastor's got the truth, that's for sure," Henry said to his wife. "But I reckon truth without kindness is a plow without seed, cuts the earth, but what grows from it?" The comment spread among the townsfolk, not as open rebellion, but as the sigh of weary souls who longed for bread as much as for iron. Ezra, of course, never heard it, or if he did, he would have dismissed it as weakness. By the end of his 10th year in ministry, Ezra had become both indispensable and feared. Children hushed at his passing. Men took off their hats. Women offered polite smiles that never reached their eyes. He had become a fixture, like the river or the courthouse clock tower, respected, immovable, but cold. The irony was that the more he was admired, the lonelier he became. Pride had carved a hollow where intimacy should have been. He lived among his people as a sentinel rather than a brother, and in the hollow grew the bitter seed. His hostility toward Mary, the one figure who seemed to offer what he had lost, what he had rejected, what he could not bear to face. He told himself it was doctrine. He told himself it was faithfulness. But deep inside, Ezra's rejection of the Virgin was not about theology. It was about grief, pride, and a wound that still bled beneath the armor of his authority. And in that hidden bitterness lay the spark of the act that would one day shock the town and seal his fate. If Ashburn was a town of work and river songs, St. Brigid's was its quiet heart. The white church stood on the hill like a lantern, its bell ringing at dawn and dusk, stitching the day with a sound that was more lullaby than command. For the Catholics of the town, the Virgin Mary was not merely a statue of stone. She was a presence, a mother's hand extended toward their troubles. Every May, the children of St. Brigid's School crowned her with flowers. Boys in pressed shirts, girls with ribbons in their hair. They climbed the steps with baskets of daisies and roses. Their laughter spilled across Willow Street, carrying the scent of blossoms into every open window. Women knelt on the church steps, whispering rosaries that fell from their fingers like beads of water. Even men hardened by river work paused, removed their caps, and bowed slightly as they passed the statue, as if greeting an old friend. To Ezra Cole, it was an abomination dressed in tenderness. From the window of his study in Grace Chapel, he could see the processions winding towards St. Brigid's Rind. He watched with a tightening jaw, his fingers drumming the desk as if itching to break the rhythm of their devotion. To him, it was deception, sorrow disguised as comfort, weakness masquerading as piety. He told himself it was his duty to speak against it. And so he did. Week after week, Ezra began to lace his sermons with warnings. "Beware of false mediators," he thundered one Sunday morning. "There is only one name under heaven by which we are saved, and it is not the name of Mary. She was a vessel, not a redeemer. She was a woman of flesh, not a queen to be adored. The congregation stiffened in their pews. Some nodded vigorously, grateful for his boldness. Others lowered their eyes, uneasy. Clara Merrick, the schoolteacher, winced as she glanced at her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who attended both Grace Chapel and, quietly, the feast days at St. Bridget's. Tears rimmed the old woman's eyes, though she bowed her head and said nothing. Ezra did not stop. He grew sharper each time, as though the more resistance he sensed, the more he needed to hammer. "The enemy of truth does not come to you with horns and a pitchfork," he declared another Sunday. "He comes with flowers. He comes with the gentle smile of a statue. He comes whispering, 'Here, find comfort in a mother's arms.' And before you know it, you are worshipping stone instead of the living God." 7. The words fell like axes. The Catholics of Ashburn heard his sermons, of course. Some ignored them, others muttered in anger, and a few pitied him, as one might pity a man who could not taste sweetness. Father O'Rourke, too serving at St. Bridget's, never mentioned Ezra's name from his pulpit. He simply reminded his flock, in his soft voice, that love could endure even scorn. "Let us not answer insult with insult," O'Rourke said. "Our Lady bore sorrow without bitterness. Let us do the same. As musicians were the Leiden dying." But among the townsfolk, division deepened. Grace Chapel parishioners began avoiding St. Bridget's feast days. Catholics whispered that Pastor Cole was consumed by pride. Friendships frayed at the edges. Invitations grew fewer across the lines of denomination. What had once been a town of neighbors was becoming a town of rivals. Ezra noticed, and part of him rejoiced. To him, division was proof that he was drawing the line where God had drawn it. He believed himself a sword of clarity, cutting through the fog of compromise. Yet in the quiet of his own heart, the truth was darker. Each time he saw flowers laid at the Virgin's feet, he felt an old ache rise, the memory of his mother's gentle hands, the tenderness that had died with her. And because he could not admit that ache, he turned it into rage. He spat his grief out as doctrine, convinced that if he struck the statue hard enough with words, he would silence the cry inside himself. One autumn evening, a procession wound its way down Willow Street for the Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows. Women carried candles in glass holders, the flames flickering like fragile stars. The statue of Mary had been draped in dark blue cloth. Her sorrowful gaze turned toward the people as they sang an old hymn in Latin. Ezra stood in the shadows across the street, cloaked in his black coat. He had told himself he only meant to observe, but as the hymn rose, something in him snapped. He saw the faces of the townsfolk glowing in candlelight, eyes lifted as though Mary herself had descended among them. The air was thick with devotion, with longing, with trust. Ezra's hands clenched into fists. "Fools," he whispered. "You kneel to stone, you bow to shadows, and you call it holy." A man beside him, not realizing who he was, murmured, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ezra turned sharply. His glare was so fierce that the stranger stumbled back, muttering an apology. Ezra walked away, his heart pounding, his thoughts burning with anger he could not quench. That night he wrote in his journal with furious strokes, "They are drunk on falsehood. I must tear down their idols. If I do not, their souls will be lost. I will show them the emptiness of stone." The ink blotched on the page where his pen pressed too hard. In the weeks that followed, Ezra's hostility hardened into obsession. He began to mention Mary, not only in sermons but in casual conversation, with an edge that made others uncomfortable. He warned children not to walk past St. Bridget's after dark, as though the statue itself were a snare. He rebuked men for letting their wives attend Catholic funerals. He became to many a prophet of anger rather than a shepherd of souls. Yet he did not see it. To him, he was a guardian of purity, a man standing on a wall while others slept. But behind the mask of righteous fury, grief gnawed at him still. The Virgin's open hands haunted him. Every time he passed the statue, it felt as though the stone woman gazed directly into his hidden wound, the wound of a son who had lost his mother and who could not forgive heaven for the loss. He hated her for seeing him. He hated her because he could not stop looking. And soon, his anger would drive him beyond words into an act so shocking that the town would never forget it. Life in Ashburn was stitched together by small rituals, the kind of daily gestures that gave the town its rhythm. The river dictated much of it, the men leaving at dawn to work the barges, the women sweeping porches before the sun rose high, the children running barefoot through the alleys until the dinner bells called them home. But if the river was the town's body, St. Brigid's was its soul. The Virgin's statue at the top of Willow Street was more than carved stone. To the people, she was a silent confidant, a figure of constancy in a world that often shifted like the water. They came to her at odd hours, at sunrise, when the mist clung low and fishermen prayed for safe return, at noon, when shopkeepers slipped away from their stalls for a moment of quiet, at dusk, when mothers lit candles and asked her to watch over children who strayed too close to the river's edge. For many, she was woven into the fabric of their lives. Mrs. Alvarez, the widow who lived next door to Clara Merrick, could often be seen sitting on the church steps with her rosary slipping through her fingers like a stream of beads. She prayed not only for her dead husband, but for her son, who had gone to the city and fallen into ruin. She listens, Mrs. Alvarez told Clara once, her eyes bright with faith. Even when no one else does, she listens. In quote 1902's. Young lovers left flowers at the Virgin's feet, not as worship, but as petitions for blessings over marriages and future children. The statue's hands seemed to cradle those hopes with a patience that no human could sustain. Even the hardened men of the docks' faces weathered, hands calloused from rope and timber, sometimes paused at the base of Willow Street, caps in hand, before trudging home. They did not stay long, nor did they speak, but the act itself spoke volumes. It was respect, even if unspoken. And then there were the children. They loved her most of all. They would clamber up the steps, leaving little gifts, wild flowers, pebbles polished by the river, sometimes even a crust of bread from their own meals. They giggled as they touched the statue's feet, but beneath the laughter was trust. To them, she was like a grandmother, always there, always smiling down, never scolding. Clara Merrick, the schoolteacher, saw how deeply this devotion shaped the people. She herself was not Catholic. She had grown up under Ezra's preaching and respected his discipline, but she found herself drawn, quietly, to the tenderness that surrounded St. Brigid's. On evenings when the chapel bells of grace were silent and Ezra's stern voice no longer echoed in her mind, she would walk by Willow Street and linger near the statue. It wasn't that she prayed, not in the way Catholics did, but she felt something there, a kind of gentleness she did not feel under Ezra's sermons. Once, when one of her pupils fell gravely ill, Clara found herself standing before the Virgin with a candle in her hand, whispering words that startled her as they left her lips. "Please, just watch over him." She told no one, least of all Ezra. The town's Catholic festivals, too, revealed the depth of their devotion. On the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, St. Brigid's glowed with hundreds of candles. Families filled the pews, their voices rising in hymns that carried out into the night air. The statue outside was draped in white, crowned with roses, and surrounded by lanterns that swayed like fireflies. Children processed with banners, their small voices chiming with the choirs. The air was thick with incense and joy. It wasn't only Catholics who came. Protestants too, though wary, sometimes slipped in at the back, drawn by the beauty. The church seemed to hold the whole town in its arms. Father O'Rourke would always speak simply. She points us to her son. She reminds us that no sorrow is wasted, no tear unseen. The people nodded, tears often streaming down their cheeks, not because of theology, but because the words felt like a balm. Ezra Cole, however, looked upon these scenes with a bitterness that cut deeper each year. From his pulpit, he railed against false comfort, From his study window, he watched the glow of candles and felt something inside him twist. To him, their devotion was weakness, and weakness, he believed, was the enemy of truth. Yet the irony was that the more he condemned them, the more their devotion seemed to grow. For every sermon he preached against Mary, another candle was lit at her feet. For every rebuke, another child laid flowers. It was as though the people, sensing his hardness, clung more tightly to her tenderness. One spring afternoon, Clara overheard two women at the market speaking of Ezra's latest sermon. "He said again that it's idolatry," one whispered, glancing around nervously. The other shook her head, defiant. "Idolatry or not, when my child was sick, I prayed to her, and he lived. Let the pastor call it what he likes. I know what I felt." Clara said nothing, but the words lingered in her mind. She thought of the Virgin's face in candlelight, the sorrowful eyes that seemed to carry both grief and peace. She thought of Ezra's sermons, sharp as iron, leaving no room for weakness. And she wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps the people loved Mary not because they had forgotten God, but because they needed a tenderness that Ezra had long since buried. Thus, the town stood divided. On one side, the stern truth of Pastor Ezra Cole, on the other, the gentle devotion of St. Brigid's. And though the people did not yet know it, these two forces, pride and tenderness, defiance and devotion, were rushing toward a collision that would shake the town to its core. The first cracks in Grace Chapel's harmony were small, almost invisible, like hairline fractures in glass that only widened under pressure. For years, Ezra's parishioners had borne his severity with quiet endurance. They told themselves it was strength, they told themselves it was zeal, but little by little, the sharpness of his words began to cut too deeply, leaving wounds where healing should have been. It started with whispers in pews. Clara Merrick heard them after services, murmured between handshakes and nods. "He preaches fire, but where's the water?" one woman asked. "Truth is good," said another, "but I miss when church felt like a refuge." They never said such things to Ezra's face. His presence was too commanding, his eyes too searching. He seemed to stand taller whenever someone questioned him, as if nourished by the resistance itself. But behind closed doors, over supper tables, and in hushed gatherings, the people began to voice their doubts. The tension became visible during funerals. Death had visited Ashburn with a cruel regularity: river accidents, illnesses, the slow grind of poverty. Families came to Grace Chapel seeking comfort, but Ezra's words at gravesides grew harsher, almost accusatory. At the funeral of a young mother, Ezra stood over the coffin and declared, "The wages of sin is death. Let this be a reminder that only repentance spares us from eternal judgment." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The grieving husband clutched his daughter closer, his face pale with shock. Later, at the wake, whispers buzzed like flies. "Is this comfort? Is this what the Lord asks of us in sorrow?" Clara, who had been there, felt her stomach turn. She remembered Father O'Rourke's funerals, how he spoke of sorrow shared, of hope held even in darkness. She thought of the Virgin's outstretched hands on Willow Street, and wondered if Ashburn's hearts were quietly moving away from Grace Chapel's stern walls. The conflict sharpened one Sunday when Ezra preached directly against the Catholics in town. His voice filled the chapel with thunder. "Do not be deceived. Do not be seduced by flowers and candles, by statues and rituals. These are snares of the enemy. Do not walk the path of idolatry, for it leads only to destruction. Is velian said in Duan Tummens, in the savors is velians from self. Is looking veli, Beasley, for great severity." The words echoed like hammer blows. Some nodded fiercely, clinging to his certainty, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Among them was Mrs. Alvarez, who lowered her head and wept silently. She was Catholic by heritage, but often came to Grace Chapel to honor her late husband's memory. Now she felt caught in a crossfire of scorn. After the service, Clara found her sitting on the chapel steps, trembling with age and grief. "Are you all right, Mrs. Alvarez?" Clara asked gently. The old woman wiped her tears with a trembling hand. "He doesn't know," she whispered. "He doesn't know what it means to lose everything and still find comfort at her feet. He doesn't know a mother's love." Clara felt a sting of shame, not for Mrs. Alvarez, but for Ezra. For the first time, she wondered whether his crusade against Mary was less about doctrine and more about something personal, something wounded. As the months passed, the tension spilled into the town itself. At the market, Catholics and Protestants began avoiding each other. Children repeated their parents' arguments in the schoolyard. "Our pastor says you bow to statues," one child taunted. "At least our church isn't cold as stone," another retorted. Clara, trying to keep order in her classroom, realized the divisions had seeped even into the youngest hearts. Even among Ezra's loyal followers, there were cracks. Henry Pike, the old farmer, confronted him after a sermon. "Pastor," Henry said, his weathered hands gripping his hat, "you preach truth, no doubt, but truth without mercy is a plow without seed. The field stays barren, people are hungry." Ezra's eyes flashed, though his voice remained controlled. "The word of God does not exist to comfort sin, Henry. It exists to expose it. Better a barren field than a harvest of weeds." Henry sighed, shaking his head. "But even weeds get rain." He walked away, leaving Ezra alone in the vestibule, his pride burning hotter than the oil lamps. The climax of the tension came during the Feast of the Assumption at St. Brigid's. Profaned the Catholics processed through the streets with candles and song, their devotion radiant. Ezra watched from a distance, his fists clenched, his jaw set like stone. When some of his parishioners were seen among the crowd, lighting candles, laying flowers at the Virgin's feet, Ezra felt fury ignite inside him. The following Sunday, his sermon was not just a warning, it was an indictment. "Some of you," he thundered, his voice shaking with restrained rage, "have chosen to bow before idols. Some of you have betrayed the living God for the comfort of stone. I tell you now, you cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. Choose this day whom you will serve." The congregation froze, stunned, some flushed with shame, others with anger. Clara felt the air in the room grow heavy, as if a storm had descended. When the final hymn was sung, many left without a word, their faces set and pale. The divide was now unmistakable. The town was split, the chapel strained, the pastor more isolated than ever. And through it all, the Virgin stood silently at the top of Willow Street, her stone face serene, her hands open as if gathering the sorrows of Ashburn into her eternal embrace. Ezra, however, saw none of her serenity. To him, the statue was a taunt, a challenge to his authority, a rival he could not endure. His bitterness had reached a boiling point. The stage was set for the act that would shatter the town's fragile balance and seal his fate. Autumn in Ashburn had always been a season of harvest and gratitude. Pumpkins lined the porches, smoke curled from chimneys, and the river carried yellow leaves like drifting prayers. Yet for Pastor Ezra Cole, the season brought no peace. Instead, it stirred in him a growing unrest, a storm tightening its grip around his soul. He had begun to dream of her, not Ruth, his mother, but the Virgin. In his dreams, she stood at the foot of his bed, her stone face somehow alive, eyes glistening with sorrow he could not escape. She said nothing, but the silence accused him more than any words could. Sometimes her hands reached out as if to bless him, and he would wake choking with fury, his fists striking the mattress as if to drive her away. During the day, he saw her everywhere. When a child laughed, he thought of the flowers they left at her feet. When a widow wept, he thought of the rosary slipping through worn fingers. Even the river's song seemed to echo her tenderness. She haunted him, not because he believed she was divine, but because she reminded him of what he could not bear, the tenderness of his mother, the mercy he had buried. And so, hatred grew where grief had once lived. One evening, after another sleepless night, Ezra sat at his desk with his Bible open, but the words blurred. He pressed his hands against his eyes, whispering verses through clenched teeth. There is one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. You shall not make for yourself a graven image. The Lord your God is a jealous God. He repeated them like incantations, as though scripture could drown out the vision of her sorrowful eyes. But the verses did not soothe, they only sharpened his rage. He slammed the Bible shut and whispered hoarsely, I will tear her down. It is like her spawned. It is veiled. The words startled even him. They felt heavy, dangerous, like striking a match near dry straw. Yet the more he repeated them, the more they felt like destiny. That Sunday, he preached with a fury that stunned even his most loyal followers. His voice was louder, his face flushed, his fists striking the pulpit until the wood trembled. Do you not see? He shouted. Do you not see how the enemy dresses lies in gentleness? How he lures you with the face of a mother while stealing the worship that belongs only to God? You think you find comfort at her feet, but it is poison. You think you are safe in her arms, but it is a snare. The Virgin Mary cannot save you. She is nothing but dust, and her image nothing but stone. The congregation sat in rigid silence. Some wept quietly, others stared at him in shock. Clara Merrick felt her stomach twist. His words sounded less like truth and more like a man at war with himself. When the service ended, no one lingered. The people filed out quickly, leaving Ezra alone in the pulpit, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his brow. The silence of the empty chapel seemed to mock him. He felt not triumph, but a gnawing hunger for something more drastic, more final. That night, Ezra walked the streets of Ashburn, his black coat whipping in the autumn wind. The town was quiet, save for the creak of shutters and the distant bark of a dog. His feet carried him, almost against his will, toward Willow Street. There she stood, the Virgin's statue, bathed in moonlight, her stone face calm, her hands outstretched. Someone had left fresh chrysanthemums at her feet. Their petals glowed pale in the dark. A single candle flickered in the glass holder, its flame shivering in the night air. Ezra's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, staring into her eyes. The stone seemed almost alive in the silver light. He remembered his dream, her silent gaze, her outstretched hands. Fury surged through him, white-hot. "Stop looking at me," he hissed. The statue, of course, said nothing, but silence is sometimes the loudest sound. Ezra raised his hand as if to strike her, then froze, his fingers trembling. A memory pierced him, the soft hand of his mother brushing his cheek, her whisper, "Mercy first, son, truth next." For a moment, his eyes burned with tears. He staggered back, clutching his chest, gasping for breath. But the tenderness lasted only a heartbeat. Pride swept in like a tide, drowning the weakness. He clenched his fists and spat on the ground before the statue. "Stone," he growled. "You are nothing but stone." The words echoed in the empty street, carried away by the wind. Ezra turned and stormed back toward the chapel, but inside him, something had shifted. He knew now that words alone would not suffice. If he was to silence her presence, if he was to prove his doctrine true, he would have to act. And the act he envisioned was one that no pastor, no man of God, should ever dare. The day it happened began with ordinary sunlight. Ashburn woke as it always did. The riverboats pushed through mist, shopkeepers raised their shutters, and the bell of Grace Chapel tolled its steady summons. Nothing in the air hinted that the town was about to witness a moment that would divide memory into before and after. Pastor Ezra Cole walked through the streets with a heaviness that had nothing to do with his body. His Bible was tucked under his arm, but it felt less like a guidebook and more like a weapon. His sermons had grown harsher in recent weeks, and though his parishioners still came, their eyes no longer shone with the same trust. Ezra sensed it. He could feel the distance widening, like a bridge cracking beneath his feet. That morning, as he passed the market, he overheard two women whispering. "Father O'Rourke says she prays with us in heaven," one said softly. "He says she intercedes." the other replied. And I believe him. When I laid flowers last week, I felt... Ezra's steps thundered against the cobblestone. He did not wait to hear the rest. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Rage burned in him not only at their words, but at the thought of the Virgin's hands reaching where his words could not. By afternoon, he could bear it no longer. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in amber. People were gathering along Willow Street for evening prayers. Children carried candles in glass jars, women carried flowers. A soft hymn began to rise, floating through the air like incense. Ezra appeared suddenly at the edge of the crowd. His black coat trailed like a shadow behind him. His face was pale, his eyes burning with something that made people step back without knowing why. He walked straight up the steps of St. Bridget's. Gasps rippled through the crowd. They had never seen him here, never so close to the statue he condemned. The Virgin Mary stood in her usual place, serene and silent. Chrysanthemums from the morning still rested at her feet, their petals glowing in the last light of day. The hymn faltered as Ezra mounted the final step. "What are you doing?" a man whispered. Ezra turned, his voice carrying like a blade through the stunned air. "You bow to stone," he said. "You deceive yourselves with flowers and candles. You turn your hearts to an idol while the living God waits." The crowd murmured, some in shock, others in anger. Father O'Rourke, she standing near the doorway, stepped forward. "Pastor Cole," he said calmly, "this is not the way." But Ezra was already moving. He stood before the statue, inches away. For a moment, he simply glared into her carved eyes, as though daring the stone to respond. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he spat his saliva, striking the Virgin's face, running down her cheek like a mockery of tears. A collective cry rose from the people. Some women screamed, others clutched their rosaries to their chests. Children stared, wide-eyed, unable to understand, but knowing something terrible had happened. Mrs. Alvarez fell to her knees, sobbing. Clara Merrick stood frozen, her heart pounding in her throat. Father O'Rourke's voice broke through the chaos, trembling yet firm. "Enough, Pastor. Go home. You do not know what you do." But Ezra only turned, his face flushed with triumph and fury. "Now you see the truth," he declared. "She is stone, nothing more. Your devotion is empty." The crowd was silent, shocked into stillness. Only the candle flames trembled in the twilight, as if even fire recoiled. Ezra descended the steps, his boots striking the stone with finality. The people parted before him like water before a blade. Some spat insults under their breath. Others simply stared at him with a mixture of horror and pity. He walked away without looking back, but the sound of their gasps and sobs followed him like a shadow. At the top of Willow Street, the Virgin remained. The spit still glistened on her cheek in the fading light, mingling with the chrysanthemums and candlelight at her feet. To the faithful, it looked not like defilement, but like a tear stone, weeping silently for the arrogance of a man who had lost his way. And though night had not yet fallen, many in Ashburn felt a chill settle over the town, as if heaven itself had borne witness to the act. That same night, Pastor Ezra Cole would die. The air in Ashburn seemed different, that evening charged, brittle, as though the town itself had witnessed a crime too great for words. The crowd outside St. Bridget's did not disperse quickly. They lingered in stunned silence, candles flickering against faces pale with shock. Mrs. Alvarez still knelt at the foot of the statue, clutching her rosary so tightly the beads cut into her palms. "Mother of God," she whispered again and again, her voice cracking. "Forgive him, forgive him." Her frail shoulders shook as tears ran freely down her cheeks. Clara Merrick tried to lift her up, but Mrs. Alvarez resisted. "No," the old woman said, shaking her head. "I will stay. She must not be left alone tonight." Children huddled against their parents, frightened by the strange violence they had seen. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Why did the pastor hurt her?" The father had no answer. He pulled his son close, his eyes glistening with helplessness. Father O'Rourke wiped the statue's cheek with his handkerchief. The cloth trembled in his hand. He said nothing for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Do not let anger poison you. What we saw tonight was pride, not power. She has endured worse. She will endure this, too." But the people could not forget. They scattered through the streets, carrying the story like wildfire. By the time night fell, the whole town was buzzing. At the market, shopkeepers whispered behind counters, "Did you hear? Pastor Cole spit on the Virgin right in front of everyone." In taverns, men shook their heads. "It's madness. He's gone too far this time. Preach against Catholics if you want, but to spit on her in public?" Some, however, defended him. "He was right," said a stern-faced man over his mug of ale. "She's just stone." He showed them the truth. "Truth!" Another spat. "That wasn't truth. That was hate. Have sees willen me to tenden. Have seed tones of the provolus, and very 6 mallows lost." The argument nearly turned to blows before neighbors pulled them apart. At the river docks, the boatman muttered, "Mark my words," one said darkly, "no man can mock a mother and walk away unpunished, not even a pastor." Grace Chapel itself felt the weight of the scandal. Parishioners avoided Ezra that evening, slipping away without a word. Some went home in silence, refusing to discuss what they had seen, as though speaking it aloud would make it more real. Others gathered in kitchens and parlors, whispering heatedly by lamplight. "Did you see his eyes?" one woman said. "Like fire, but not holy fire. It was something else." Another shivered. It was as though he wasn't himself. Henry Pike, the old farmer, spoke with unusual gravity. "Pride blinds a man until he can't see he's walking off a cliff. I fear Ezra's already falling." Even among the children, the act became a story retold in hushed voices. Some claimed the statue had wept real tears after the pastor spat. Others swore they saw the candle flames bow lower, as if in mourning. Whether true or not, the tales spread quickly, taking on the weight of omen. By midnight, Ashburn was divided between fear and outrage. Some saw Ezra's defiance as boldness, others as blasphemy. But everyone agreed on one thing: something had shifted. The town did not feel the same. The air was too still, the river too quiet, the night too heavy. In her small room, Clara sat by her window, staring toward Willow Street. She could still see the faint glow of candles where the faithful kept vigil by the statue. She thought of Ezra's face contorted with rage, triumphant and broken all at once. She had once admired him. She had once believed his strength was a gift. Now she wondered if his strength had become his curse. She whispered into the silence, unsure if she was praying or only speaking her heart. "God help us. Something terrible is coming." And in the dark streets of Ashburn, where whispers moved faster than the wind, the town waited in uneasy silence for what the night would bring. Night fell over Ashburn with unusual weight, as if the town had been draped in a heavy cloth. The river, usually alive with ripples and faint songs of frogs, moved in silence, thick, dark, unbroken. The wind, too, seemed to die, leaving the air still and expectant, as though even nature had paused to listen. Candles still burned at the feet of the Virgin on Willow Street. The faithful had not abandoned her, not after what they had witnessed. Women prayed in whispers, their rosaries clicking softly in the night air. Men stood watch nearby, their faces grim, their hands gripping hats or lanterns as if to ward off the unease creeping into their bones. Clara Merrick walked past on her way home from tending to Mrs. Alvarez, who refused to leave the statue's side. Clara noticed how the candlelight trembled, not because of wind, but as if the flames themselves shivered. She tried to dismiss the thought, but it lodged in her heart like a thorn. Elsewhere in town, doors were bolted earlier than usual. Families gathered inside with hushed voices. Mothers held their children close, as if instinct told them danger stalked the streets. Fathers stared out of windows, watching shadows grow longer, darker. At the tavern, men who usually drank late slipped out quickly, muttering excuses. "Feels strange tonight," one said, "like the air's waiting for something." Old Mrs. Keaton, known for her sharp tongue and keener instincts, stood on her porch muttering, "God doesn't let a man spit on his mother without answer. No, he does not. Judgment walks tonight." Her words carried down the street, making neighbors glance nervously at their lamps. In his study at Grace Chapel, Ezra Cole sat at his desk, the lamp flickering over his open Bible. But he was not reading. His hands were clenched, his eyes hollow. He could still feel the moment the spit leaving his mouth, striking cold stone. At first, it had felt like victory, a cleansing act of defiance. But now, alone in the silence, the memory curdled. Why had the crowd gasped that way? Why had their faces looked less defeated and more horrified? He told himself they were blind, deceived. He told himself he had revealed the truth. Yet the echo of their gasps clung to him, louder than his own words. The lamp sputtered. A draft swept through the room, though no window was open. Ezra froze, his breath catching. For a moment, he thought he smelled incense, the faint, unmistakable sweetness that clung to St. Bridget's during feast days. He rose abruptly, knocking his chair back. "Nonsense," he muttered, too loudly for comfort. "It's in my head, nothing more." But the smell lingered, faint yet undeniable. At Willow Street, the prayers continued, soft and steady. A child suddenly whimpered, pointing to the statue. "Mama," she whispered, "she's crying." The mother gasped, bending to hush her daughter. Others looked closer. The flickering candles cast strange shadows across the Virgin's face, and in the shifting light it seemed just for an instant that a line of moisture traced her cheek, glistening like a tear. Some fell to their knees at once. Others crossed themselves, whispering in awe. "Miracle," someone murmured. "She weeps for us." Father O'Rourke cautioned them gently. "Do not leap to signs. Faith does not need wonders." But even his voice trembled as he wiped his brow. The people prayed harder, their voices a rising tide against the silence of the night. Back at the chapel, Ezra paced his study. The silence pressed in like walls. He lit another lamp, but its flame flickered weakly, as though reluctant to burn. He thought he heard footsteps in the hallway. He spun, but the corridor was empty. His heart pounded. He sat again, gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles whitened. And then came the sound, faint, almost imperceptible at first. A woman's voice, singing. Not loud, not clear, but soft, mournful, as though carried on distant air. The melody was unfamiliar, yet it struck him with piercing recognition. It was the kind of song his mother used to hum while baking bread, weaving tenderness into the walls of their home. Ezra leapt to his feet, rage and fear twisting together. "No!" he shouted into the emptiness. "You will not haunt me. You are stone, nothing but stone." But his voice shook. For the first time in years, Pastor Ezra Cole felt afraid, not of man, not of doctrine, but of something greater, moving silently in the night. The town slept uneasily. The faithful prayed, and Ezra sat alone with shadows that seemed to whisper from every corner. The night had only begun, but Ashburn already felt gripped by a dread that no one could name. The parsonage of Grace Chapel was usually quiet, a square, unremarkable house with wooden floors that creaked predictably and windows that rattled in the wind. Ezra had always found its stillness, comforting a fortress for his study, his prayers, his solitude. But that night, the house seemed to breathe with a life of its own. It began with the walls. As Ezra sat rigid at his desk, he swore the plaster shifted like faint tremors running through the bones of the house. He told himself it was the settling of old timber, nothing more. Yet the sound carried a rhythm, too deliberate to be chance. 3 faint knocks, a pause, 3 again. His lamp flickered low. He leaned forward to trim the wick, and for an instant he saw it, the shadow of a woman's form stretching across the wall. Not his own, not any shape he could explain. The figure stood still, hands outstretched, as if in silent offering. Ezra blinked hard, and the shadow dissolved into nothing. He muttered scripture under his breath, clutching his Bible as though it were a shield. "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" But the words felt thin, as if they vanished before reaching his lips. The sounds grew stranger as the night deepened. From the hallway came the faint creak of footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. Ezra rose and thrust open the door. Nothing. The corridor stretched empty, the lamplight revealing only bare floorboards and the cross nailed to the far wall. He closed the door firmly, but the footsteps returned minutes later, pacing back and forth as though unseen feet wandered the house. Then came the whispers. At first, they were no louder than the rustling of leaves, indistinct murmurs slipping through the cracks of silence. He pressed his ear to the wall, thinking perhaps a neighbor lingered outside. But the whispers rose within the room itself, circling, hissing, low voices he could not understand. He slammed the Bible onto his desk. "Enough," he barked. "You are nothing. You are lies." The whispers ceased. The silence was worse. Ezra tried to pray, but each time he opened his mouth, the words faltered. Memories intruded: his mother's weak breath on her deathbed, the slips of paper she had hidden in his jacket with words of mercy. "Mercy first, son. Truth next." The phrase returned like a blade, cutting deeper the more he tried to resist it. He pressed his palms to his temples, shaking his head violently. "No," he growled. "Mercy is weakness. Mercy is indulgence." And yet, from the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a figure kneeling silent, sorrowful, her head bowed in prayer. He turned sharply, but the corner was empty. Only the chair sat there, vacant, yet somehow waiting. As the hours dragged toward midnight, the air in the parsonage grew heavy, dense. Ezra lit every lamp he owned, but the darkness seemed to thicken between them, pressing against the light as if alive. The flames hissed, struggling, shrinking low. Then, without warning, the house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that rattled the windows. A gust of air swept through, snuffing out every lamp but one. Ezra stood in near darkness, chest heaving. From the shadows, a sound rose. Not whispers this time, but weeping, soft, mournful, distinctly feminine. It came from everywhere at once: the corners, the floorboards, even the air itself. Ezra staggered back, his knees nearly buckling. His throat tightened. For a fleeting second, grief cracked through his armor of pride. He thought of his mother, her gentle eyes, her dying words. The sobs seemed to carry her voice, woven with every mercy he had rejected. "Stop!" Ezra shouted, his voice breaking. "You are not real! You are stone!" But his protest sounded hollow, drowned out by the steady sound of unseen weeping. And then silence again. The last lamp guttered out. The parsonage plunged into darkness so complete it felt like drowning. Ezra's breath came ragged, each inhale scraping his throat. He gripped the Bible to his chest, but the leather felt cold, foreign. Out of the blackness came a single sound, a knock, loud and sharp, directly at the front door. 3 times it struck, echoing through the hollow house. Ezra froze. His legs refused to move. The knock came again, slower, heavier. Summoning what pride he had left, he forced himself toward the door. He flung it open. Only silence. No one stood outside. The street was empty, the night still. But on the doorstep, laid neatly, as if by unseen hands, were 3 white chrysanthemums. Ezra's breath caught. His hand trembled as he bent closer. They were fresh, dew still clinging to their petals, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The same flowers that had been laid at the Virgin's feet that morning. He slammed the door shut, his heart hammering. Sweat drenched his brow. For the first time in his life, Pastor Ezra Cole felt the full weight of fear, not of death, not of man, but of judgment, approaching like footsteps in the dark. And the night was far from over. Ezra Cole was a man who had built his life on certainty. Doctrine was his fortress, scripture his sword, and logic his shield. Fear had no place in his world until that night. He sat in his study, the chrysanthemums still fresh in his mind, their pale petals gleaming like ghosts at his doorstep. He tried to pray, but the words clung to his throat, heavy and unspoken. He slammed the Bible open, stabbing his finger at the page. "The Lord is my refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." But his voice shook as he read it aloud. Trouble, yes, but where was the help? The words sounded hollow, like a man knocking on a door that refused to open. He closed the book sharply and began to pace. "This is madness," he muttered. "A trick of the mind. Fatigue, nothing more. They are flowers, Ezra. Flowers, not signs. Shadows, not spirits. You are a man of God, not a child afraid of the dark." His rationalizations stacked one on top of the other, like sandbags against a rising flood. But the flood kept coming. The footsteps returned slow, measured, dragging slightly as if weighted with sorrow. This time, they echoed across the ceiling above him. Ezra's head snapped upward. No one lived above. His house had no attic, only rafters and dust. The sound grew louder, until it seemed a whole procession passed overhead many feet, shuffling in unison. He pressed his hands over his ears, but still he heard it, pounding like a heartbeat through the walls. Then came the voices again, not whispers this time, but clear, distinct words. "Mercy first, son. Truth next." His mother's voice. Ezra staggered back as though struck. "No," he roared. "You are dead. You are gone. Leave me." But the voice came again, softer now, like a lullaby. "Mercy first." Tears burned his eyes. He hated them. He had not cried in years, not even at Ruth's funeral. He had buried mercy long ago. And yet here it was, rising like water through cracked stone, threatening to drown him. Desperate, Ezra fled the study and stumbled into the chapel itself. The sanctuary was dark, the moonlight pouring through stained glass, painting the pews in fractured colors. The silence was thick, oppressive. He walked down the aisle toward the altar, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the emptiness. There, on the communion table, lay something that made his blood run cold. Another chrysanthemum. White, perfect, untouched. He reached for it with a trembling hand, then snatched it back as though the flower burned. "This is not real," he whispered hoarsely. "This is a test, a delusion. The devil seeks to frighten me." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of eyes upon him. Slowly, he turned toward the back of the chapel. A figure stood in the shadows. It was faint, barely outlined by moonlight, but unmistakably a woman, head bowed, hands outstretched, her form still and sorrowful. Ezra's knees nearly buckled. "No," he rasped. "You are stone. You are nothing but stone." The figure did not move. She did not need to. Her silence filled the chapel more than any shout could. Ezra stumbled backward until his legs struck the first pew. His breath came ragged, his chest tight. Rage flared as the only weapon he had left. "I am the pastor of this town," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I am the voice of truth. You are lies. You are weakness. I will not bow. Das you makes in the nace." His words rang against the walls, echoing back to him like mockery. The figure remained, silent, patient. Suddenly, the stained glass windows rattled violently, as though struck by invisible hands. The sound of shattering threatened, but the glass held. Candles that had not been lit all evening flared to life at once, their flames bending toward the altar as if pulled by unseen breath. The chapel was no longer silent. It pulsed with a presence Ezra could not name, one that pressed against his pride until it cracked. He fell to his knees, not in prayer but in exhaustion. His hands clutched the pew, his body shaking. "What do you want from me?" he whispered hoarsely. No voice answered. Only the chrysanthemums remained, glowing pale in the moonlight, their petals like tears fallen from a sorrow too deep for words. And in the shadows, the silent figure did not leave. The night was not yet finished with Pastor Ezra Cole. The sanctuary of Grace Chapel had never felt so heavy, so alive with something unseen. Ezra knelt, trembling in the aisle, his fists clenched against the wooden pew, sweat beading down his face. His chest rose and fell like a bellows, each breath sharper than the last. The figure at the back of the chapel remained motionless, shrouded in moonlight, hands open, head bowed, sorrow carved into stillness. Ezra could not bear it. He surged to his feet, rage bubbling through the cracks of his fear. "You are nothing," he roared. "Stone, lies, weakness." His voice shook the air, but the words rang hollow. The candles flared higher, the stained glass shivered, and then silence fell, so absolute it rang louder than sound. Ezra stumbled forward to the altar. The chrysanthemum still lay there, pure white against the dark wood. He grabbed it in his hand, crushing the petals, grinding them into pulp. "You will not haunt me," he shouted, his voice cracking. At that very moment, the great bell of Grace Chapel tolled. Once, twice, 13 times. Ezra froze. His mind reeled. The bell was locked, chained until Sunday. No one could ring it now. And yet its mournful chime rolled through the night, announcing something he could not name. The air grew thick, choking. Ezra gasped, his throat closing as though unseen hands pressed against it. He dropped the crushed flower and clawed at his collar, stumbling backward. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the altar rail. Shadows lengthened across the floor, crawling toward him. The candles sputtered, their flames bending as if in mourning. From the rafters came a sound, a woman's weeping, soft, steady, unrelenting. Ezra squeezed his eyes shut. "No, I will not bend, I will not bow." But his words faltered into a ragged whisper. His body trembled violently. His hand, clutching the Bible to his chest, loosened. The book fell to the floor with a dull thud, pages fluttering open to a verse his mother had once slipped into his pocket. "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out." Ezra's eyes widened, his lips parted, as if to speak, perhaps to pray, perhaps to beg. But the sound never came. A sudden crack of thunder shook the chapel, though no storm touched Ashburn's skies. The windows rattled once, then fell still. When the silence returned, Pastor Ezra Cole lay motionless at the foot of the altar, his face pale, his eyes fixed on nothing. No wound marked him, no blow had struck him. His body bore no sign of violence. Yet his expression was twisted in a final mixture of terror and awe, as though in his last breath he had seen something greater than all his pride, something that shattered him completely. The crushed chrysanthemum lay beside him, its white petals scattered like fragments of snow across the dark floor. It was not until dawn that anyone found him. Clara Merrick, concerned by the strange tolling of the bell and unable to sleep, approached Grace Chapel just as the first light touched the river. She found the doors unlatched, the candles burned to stubs. When her eyes fell upon Ezra's body, she stopped breathing. For a moment, she thought he was kneeling in prayer. But then she saw the stillness, the lifeless slack of his hands. Clara sank to her knees, tears spilling down her cheeks. She did not weep only for him, but for what had been lost, the man he could have been, the pastor he once was, the wound he had never healed. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, the town gathered in stunned silence outside the chapel. Some whispered of judgment, others of mercy. Many looked toward Willow Street, where the Virgin still stood, her stone face serene, her hands outstretched as though in eternal embrace. The spit that had stained her cheek was gone, washed away by dew. To those who looked closely, it seemed as though her face bore a faint sheen of moisture, like the trace of tears shed in the night. And so it was that Pastor Ezra Cole, who had spat upon the Virgin, met his death the very night of his defiance. His end was not marked by violence of man, but by the mystery of heaven, an answer too deep for words, a justice wrapped in sorrow. When the news broke at sunrise, it traveled through Ashburn faster than the river current. By noon, every door had opened to whispers. Every porch hummed with voices low and uneasy. "Dead?" people repeated in disbelief. "Pastor Cole is dead?" The manner of it was the subject of endless speculation. Some claimed he had fallen to his knees in prayer and simply never risen. Others said he had been struck down by lightning, even though no storm had passed. A few, eyes wide with fear, whispered that his own arrogance had summoned judgment from heaven. Children repeated what they had overheard from adults. "They say the Virgin cried last night," one girl said to another, "and when she cried, the pastor died." At the docks, men spoke in grim tones. "No man spits on a mother's face and lives to boast about it," one said, shaking his head. "The Almighty doesn't turn a blind eye to that." Even those who defended him during life faltered in their loyalty now. He was a strong preacher, they admitted, but perhaps too strong. Perhaps he forgot mercy. He forgot mercy. The people of Grace Chapel were torn between grief and fear. On the morning after his death, they gathered in silence within the sanctuary, staring at the altar where Ezra's body had been found. The crushed chrysanthemum still lay there, its petals scattered like pale confetti of mourning. No one dared touch it. Henry Pike, the old farmer, stood in the front pew, hat clutched against his chest. "He was our pastor," he said softly, "but he was also a man, and a man can break." His voice trembled. "Let us remember the good he gave us, but let us also heed the warning his death leaves behind." Some wept openly, mourning the stern shepherd who had once led them with fire. Others sat stone-faced, haunted not only by his loss, but by the manner of it. They could not escape the thought that Ezra's final act, the spit on the Virgin's face, had somehow been tied to his sudden end. At St. Brigid's, Ursay, the response was more complex. The faithful kept vigil at the statue through the day, their prayers now laced with awe and fear. For many, Ezra's death was proof that heaven itself had answered. Mrs. Alvarez, still trembling from the memory, whispered to Father O'Rourke. She defended herself. She didn't need to move, didn't need to speak. Heaven spoke for her. But O'Rourke shook his head gently. "Do not hunger for vengeance, my child. If judgment came, it was God's, not hers. Our Lady weeps, but she does not strike." N.D. Seaman, level live of the present and Guther. Still, the people were unconvinced. For them, the sight of Ezra's lifeless body and the dew upon the Virgin's face were too entwined to be coincidence. The story began to spread beyond Ashburn, first to neighboring villages, then whispered along the river by travelers. The pastor who spat upon Mary and died that same night. Clara Merrick felt the weight of both sorrow and revelation. She had seen Ezra's descent, step by step, pride hardening into bitterness, bitterness erupting into defiance. She remembered his sharp sermons, his unyielding certainty, the fire in his eyes when he spat on the statue. Now he was gone, stripped not by human hands, but by something far beyond. Clara sat alone in her schoolroom after the news, staring at the chalkboard where the children's lessons waited unfinished. "He needed mercy," she whispered. "Mercy he could never accept. Namblay and meneveri." Her voice broke, and she covered her face, weeping quietly not only for Ezra, but for all those who mistook pride for faith. As dusk fell, townsfolk gathered outside Grace Chapel, holding candles. Some prayed aloud for Ezra's soul, others simply stood in silence, their faces pale with a fear they could not put into words. Across town, another group gathered by the Virgin's statue, laying new flowers at her feet. Two vigils, two flames of faith, one stern and sorrowful, the other tender and awed, flickered across Ashburn that night. And though they seemed divided, everyone felt the same chill. Pastor Ezra Cole's death was no ordinary passing. It was a story written in fire and shadow, in pride and tears, in a silence that carried the weight of judgment. The town would not forget, not in their lifetime, nor in the lives of their children. Not everyone in Ashburn belonged firmly to Grace Chapel or St. Brigid's See. Some stood at the edges of both, watching, listening, living their lives without pledging themselves wholly to one fold or the other. Among them was Samuel Turner, the town's librarian. Samuel was a quiet man, tall and stoop-shouldered, with spectacles perched permanently at the tip of his nose. He kept mostly to himself, cataloguing books, repairing spines, and recommending novels to restless schoolchildren. But he also had the habit of listening more than speaking, and in a small town like Ashburn, that meant he carried the weight of many voices. When Pastor Ezra died, Samuel did not rush to judgment as others did. He did not claim it was divine justice, nor did he dismiss it as coincidence. Instead, he walked the town streets in the days that followed, observing. He watched the people gather in frightened clusters. He saw children point in hushed awe toward the Virgin statue, whispering tales of her weeping. He heard men at the tavern argue about pride and punishment until their voices cracked, and he wondered not about Ezra's death, but about what it revealed in the living. One evening, Samuel sat on the steps of the library, his pipe unlit in his hand, staring at the faint glow of candles on Willow Street. Clara Merrick passed by on her way home from the vigil and paused when she saw him. "You're not at the chapel?" she asked gently. Samuel shook his head. "Nor at St. Brigid's. Dear Lint, I'm at neither place these days." Clara tilted her head, curious. "Then where do you stand, Samuel?" He smiled faintly. "On the edge, watching the waves crash between them." He gestured toward the chapel on one end of town and the church on the other. Truth on one side, tenderness on the other, and somehow both incomplete without the other. Clara sat beside him, weary. "He was so certain," she murmured, "so certain he was right. And yet certainty can be a blade," Samuel said softly, "sharp enough to cut others, sharp enough to cut the one who wields it." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of prayers drifting from Willow Street. Later, alone in the library, Samuel pulled down a dusty book of theology. He read by lamplight, his mind restless. He underlined a passage, "Faith without humility is not faith, but pride disguised as devotion." He closed the book slowly. "Perhaps that is what happened," he whispered to the empty room. "Ezra mistook pride for faith, and pride is a fire that consumes its own house." But another thought gnawed at him. Was Ezra's death purely the consequence of pride, or had something beyond human comprehension reached into Ashburn that night? He remembered the rumors of weeping, of candles flaring, of flowers appearing where none had been. He remembered the terror on Clara's face when she spoke of finding Ezra at dawn. He could not dismiss these things as mere imagination. Still, Samuel was not a man of visions. He dealt in words, in stories, and he knew that stories, whether true or not, shaped people's lives as much as facts did. The story spreading through Ashburn was clear. A pastor spat on the Virgin Mary, and before the sun rose, he was dead. To the Catholics, it was proof of her power and her sorrow. To many Protestants, it was a warning that zeal without mercy leads to ruin. To Samuel, it was something deeper still. It was a mirror. It revealed the hunger of the people for comfort, the danger of a faith without tenderness, and the mystery of a God who allowed both defiance and downfall to unfold in one night. Standing before the statue one evening, Samuel watched the candles flicker. He did not kneel, nor did he cross himself. He simply bowed his head and whispered, "Perhaps you are stone, perhaps you are more, but either way, you remind us of something we cannot live without mercy." For Spin. He turned and walked away, the echo of his words lingering in the quiet street. Ashburn would carry many interpretations of Ezra's death, each colored by faith, fear, or skepticism. But for Samuel, and for a few who listened to his quiet reflections, the meaning was not about punishment or miracle. It was about humility, about the cost of forgetting mercy, about the danger of closing one's heart to tenderness, even in the name of truth. And in that lesson, Samuel believed, lay the true story, not just of Ezra Cole, but of every soul in Ashburn. Ashburn did not return to normal after Pastor Ezra's death. Something had shifted like the river after a flood. The town's course was subtly, irreversibly altered. People walked with quieter steps. Conversations at the market carried an edge of caution, as though no one wished to speak too boldly in the shadow of what had happened. The statue on Willow Street became the silent center of the town. Fresh flowers appeared at her feet each morning, wild daisies from children, roses from widows, chrysanthemums from men who rarely knelt for anything. Her face, unchanged in its carved serenity, seemed to hold a new weight, a new authority. Grace Chapel, too, changed. For weeks, its pews sat half empty, as if the congregation feared the walls might still echo Ezra's fury. Eventually, the church reopened under the care of a gentler interim minister, one who preached more softly, with more stories of compassion than thunder of judgment. People came back slowly, but they never forgot. When the new pastor spoke of mercy, they listened with a hunger they had not known before. The funeral of Pastor Ezra Cole was a complicated affair. Both congregations attended, Protestants and Catholics standing side by side, united not in agreement, but in shared humanity. Some wept openly, mourning the man who had once guided them. Others stood stiffly, torn between sorrow and unease. Father O'Rourke spoke at the graveside, his voice steady, his words careful. He was a man who sought truth with fierce devotion. Perhaps, in the end, he forgot mercy. But mercy does not forget us. May God, who is greater than our pride, receive him with the gentleness we all need. Have today you, some those. The words lingered in the air, neither condemnation nor excuse, but something in between, something merciful. As seasons turned, the story of Ezra's defiance and death grew into legend. Travelers along the river carried it to distant towns. The pastor who spat upon the Virgin Mary and died that same night. To some, it was a cautionary tale of arrogance punished. To others, it was a mystery too deep to explain. For Ashburn, it became both warning and reminder. Parents told their children, never mock what others hold sacred, never let pride blind you to mercy. The tale was repeated not with cruelty but with awe, as if Ezra's life and death were a parable written into the town's history. Clara Merrick, who had watched his fall more closely than most, carried the lesson quietly within her heart. In her classroom, when children bickered, she often reminded them, truth matters, but so does kindness. One without the other breaks us. She never mentioned Ezra by name, but the shadow of his story lived in every word. Samuel Turner, the librarian, kept a record in his careful hand, part fact, part reflection. He ended his account with a single line: Ashburn learned that truth without mercy is pride, and pride without humility is death. Years later, the Virgin's statue still stood at the top of Willow Street. The paint on her robe had faded, and the stone had weathered, but her hands remained open, her face eternally calm. Pilgrims from other towns sometimes came to see her, drawn by the story of the pastor's fall. They would stand before her, silent, as the townsfolk of Ashburn did daily. And in that silence, many claimed to feel the same thing, not vengeance, not triumph, but sorrow, and beneath the sorrow, mercy. The people of Ashburn never fully agreed on whether Ezra's death was miracle or coincidence, but they all agreed on the message it left behind. That arrogance can destroy even the most devout. That truth without tenderness is only half the gospel. That mercy, once forgotten, will return sometimes gently, sometimes like a flood. And above all, that faith is not about triumph over others, but about humility before mysteries greater than ourselves. So the town remembered, and in their remembering, they lived a little more gently, prayed a little more humbly, and looked upon one another with deeper respect. Pastor Ezra Cole's story became their caution, their parable, their inheritance. And the Virgin, silent and sorrowful, continued her watch hands open, as though still ready to forgive.